morning and good afternoon, my dear audience. I'm Honam Shah, a senior content analyst from Leader Associates, and I'm really delighted to be your host of this impact webinar. What's next? Converting CCUS strategy into practice through policy and project clarity. As you all know, the momentum behind CCUS continues to grow. In 2024 alone, projects representing more than 75 million tons per year of new capacity have been announced. A really clear signal of the increasing global commitment to carbon management. But with that momentum comes complexity. Different regions are moving at different speeds, shaped by various policy regulatory approaches and investment priorities. That's why aligning strategies across both policy and project delivery is more important than ever. In today's session, we're bringing together the leading policymakers and industry voices from 7 of the most dynamic CCUS markets, including European Union, Norway, Denmark, Canada, Japan, and Singapore. They will share updates, insights, and strategic perspective on everything from project deployment and policy framework to the role of innovation in scaling up CCUS. And our goal is to foster practical cross-regional dialogue and help bridge the gap between ambition and implementation, supporting the kind of international cooperation needed to make the large-scale CCUS a reality in years ahead. Without further ado, I would like to invite our opening keynote speaker on stage, Ms. Anastasia Cooper, the research analyst CCUS at Mackenzie. And she will provide us with an overview of the prospect and challenges of the global CCUS industry and key strategies of driving growth of CCUS supply chain with international collaborations. Please welcome Ms. Anastasia Cooper. Hi, Anastasia.
Perfect.
Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for that introduction and for having me along today. My name is Stacey Cooper and I'm a CCUS research analyst from Wood Mackenzie based in Edinburgh. So today I'm just going to be giving you a short presentation discussing the industry's journey through the 2020 so far, some of the wins and some of the key challenges and what we expect to see over the next 5 years. Perfect. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the 2020s is really a pivotal decade for CCUS. And as we all know, the industry has some big ambitions to meet by 2030. So the charts here show announced operational capacity across the whole CCUS value chain. So this includes capacity across capture, transport, and storage projects, as announced by companies. So in 2020, we had approximately 208 Mtpa of capacity operating globally. Around 180 million tons of this was focused in North America, with the US making up a significant majority. Of the storage capacity included here as well, the majority is associated with CCS EOR projects. So over the last 5 years, we've seen global capacity increase by just under 30 million tons. But by 2030, companies have announced they're targeting an additional 1.2 BTPA of capacity to become operational. You can see in 2025, the same regional share of global capacity persists as 2020. However, over the next 5 years, this trend will change significantly. North America will remain the front runner, but Europe will see the most aggressive rollout of capacity, shifting its rank in the global context from last to second place. APAC will further cement itself in third place, and Latin America and the Middle East will somewhat lag behind. So one of the main drivers for this changing share of regional capacity over the next 5 years is the readiness of these regions, of course, to deploy CCUS. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as we've got a lot of policy speakers coming up, I'm just going to give a bit of a high-level overview of the sort of current global policy landscape. So as you would have seen from the last slide, not a whole lot more of capacity has become operational over the last 5 years. However, the industry has made good progress in the policy and regulation space, which will support more projects coming online over the coming years. So this map here, we have our policy readiness index. Unfortunately, I think my key may have been missed from some formatting in the transfer to you guys, but I think you can still get the gist. So our policy readiness index is an internally developed metric we use to evaluate and compare how different countries approach policy, regulation, and support. So we've designed this index to rank countries on a scale of 0 to 4. So a score of 0 indicates countries which currently have no active CCUS policies in place, and at the upper end, a score of 4 represents countries that have implemented the most comprehensive support measures. So you can see the ones in red, they would have a score of around of 0 to 1, and the ones in green, they're approaching with the 4 end of the scale. So on the right-hand side, you can see the assessment criteria we use to rank policy readiness. So this includes national targets for CCUS, net zero targets, carbon pricing, so both price and coverage to incentives for CCUS, tax incentives and funding, both availability and accessibility, and regulatory enablers of capture, infrastructure, and storage. So if you look at the map, you can quite clearly see that the most developed regions there are in green, are North America and Europe. So in North America, particularly the USA, policy support for carbon capture has been rolled out for a number of years. For instance, the US launched its 45Q in 2008, which enabled tax incentives for CO2 stored via EOR and dedicated storage. And of course, in 2022, the IRA further enhanced the 45Q tax credit and significantly improved project economics. On the other hand, in Europe, we've seen a rapid rollout of policy support for CCUS over the last 5 years. Northwest European countries such as the UK, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands are now some of the global leaders in policy readiness. If we take Denmark as a little example here, Denmark is now ranked #1 globally with a score of 3.9 out of 4. And over the last 5 years, Denmark has gone from having a CO2 storage ban in 2020 to now recognizing CCUS as a key decarbonisation strategy, hosting multiple CO2 storage rounds, both onshore and offshore, and taking FID on one of Europe's first CO2 storage hubs, Greensand. The EU has also taken a block approach to policy with its Net Zero Industry Acts. The NZIAs is the first example we've seen of a carbon take-back and details oil and gas producers must provide 50 Mtpa of storage capacity by 2030, prorated to their production within the EU. So in contrast to North America and Europe, Asia-Pacific countries haven't made as much progress, but still progress nonetheless. 6 out of the 15 countries in this region still have an above average policy readiness score. Australia and Japan are the most developed, followed by Singapore and South Korea. Malaysia and Indonesia are catching up, both having worked on integrating policy into national law over the last year. However, big emitters such as China and India need to do more to support their country's ambitious CCUS plans. A key enabler of CCUS in these regions as well is the cross-border carbon transport, although agreements between countries here remain nascent and need to accelerate to ensure that countries with limited storage acreage can decarbonise as well. So as you can see, there's really no silver bullet to the policy framework. Every country has a different approach, but it's clear that increasing policy support is fundamental to reducing regulatory hurdles, bringing costs down, and getting projects over that FID line. Next slide, please. So on that point of getting costs down, let's see how costs currently sit along with the industry. So this chart here shows the levelized cost of CCUS in relation to 2025 and 2030 operating capture capacity. So we have project count there along the y-axis and the levelized cost of CCUS along the x-axis. The size of the bubbles here represents operating capacity. So the solid filled ones are 2025, and then the patterned larger ones are 2030. And this is what's announced to be operational by 2030. So as this is quite a complex chart, there's a lot going on. I'm going to break it up into sort of 3 key takeaways for you. So firstly, there is a significant variation in the costs across the industries. You can see there our x-axis is going from around 50 to 300. And this cost disparity is the primary factor driving the current adaptation of CCS across the different technologies. For instance, natural gas processing, so that's this maroon bubble here, has the lowest levelized cost of CCUS at $70 per ton of CO2, but the highest operational capture capacity at 60 Mtpa. Whereas waste energy and BECCS, at this very small purple dot down the bottom here, costs around $100 more per ton of CO2 and has the lowest operational total capacity, operating capacity at 0.1 Mtpa. Secondly, our forecast shows that these costs will go down by 2030. And this is a trend we foresee continuing into the 2030s and 40s. Lowering costs will support harder to abate industries coming forward and adopting CCS. However, the cost for these industries, such as steel, petrochemicals and refining, cement, power generation, is still incredibly high, having only experienced on average an 8% decline by 2030. So that leads me to my final point, which is these costs will not come down enough alone to incentivize CCUS. To demonstrate this point, I've shown the EU ETS there in the grey dashed lines. So as we all know, the EU ETS is one of the most progressed and volatile carbon pricing regimes, but it still is not high enough to cover the cost of capture for most industries. Only ethanol and natural gas processing have costs lower than the current EU ETS price of around $80 per tonne of CO2. But by 2030, most industries, other than power generation, will sit below the forecasted price of $144. However, a lot of the capacity associated with these hard-to-abate high-cost sectors, such as your power generation, your steel and cement, sit in countries with far less bullish carbon pricing regimes. And as long as the carbon price remains lower than the cost of CCUS, it's challenging for companies to realise their announced capacity. Perfect. Next slide, please. So you've seen how global capacity is shared. You've seen a high-level overview of policy advancements and how costs are impacting projects moving forward. So now I'm going to be showing you some analysis on some of the key milestones these projects hit, such as FID and FEED. So with these ambitious plans for 2030, companies have got a lot of capacity they're targeting to become operational. The clock is really ticking to get projects through key milestones. So the first chart on the left here shows our view on final investment decisions by year, capacity, and project count. So you can see by the pink dots there, we've seen a steady rise in the number of projects taking FID since 2020. Now, if you look at the teal bars, you can see we have a risked and an unrisked view. So unrisked is what companies have announced, and a risked capacity is something we calculate using a project likelihood metric. So 2025 is really set to be a bumper year for FIDs, with nearly 270 Mtpa targeting FID this year. On a risk basis, this equates to around 171 Mtpa. We've already seen some highly anticipated FIDs coming to fruition this year, such as the UK's Liverpool Bay TNS project and Norway's phase 2 of its Northern Lights. But in fact, over the next 3 years, we expect to see a record number of final investment decisions as companies race to get projects into pre-2030 operations. But if you look at the chart on the right-hand side there, you'll notice that 70% of the remaining capacity targeting FID this decade is still yet to enter FEED. So this gives companies a very expedited timeline to enter FEEDs, complete FEED, take FID, construct their projects, and start operations in time for 2030. So, that's even a bit of a mouthful to say, let alone what that actually means in practice. Next slide, please. So with these ambitious plans for 2030, what is Wood Mackenzie's view on what will actually come to fruition? So this chart shows our outlook view on capture capacity by region. So this analysis takes into account policy readiness, demand for carbon capture, and announced capacity. Current operational capture capacity sits at around 70 Mtpa, and our forecast shows an almost threefold increase over the next 5 years to 250 Mtpa. Although this is a fairly less aggressive outlook in comparison to company announcements, there's still a long way to go, and if policies aren't improved, costs aren't lowered, and FIDs don't happen, company and country level 2030 targets are going to be in jeopardy. So there's a long way to go, but we are heading in the right direction. While challenges remain, the CCUS industry is undeniably gaining momentum, and with policy frameworks maturing and regulation taking shape, and an increasing number of projects advancing through crucial development stages, we are beginning to witness a transformative period that begins to set the stage for CCUS to play a pivotal role in our global decarbonisation efforts in years to come. Perfect. That's me. If you want to go to the next slide. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and happy to take any questions.
What was mute?
I think you're muted yourself, sorry.
Can you hear me, Anastasia?
Yes, I can, yes.
All right. I want to say thank you so much, Anastasia, for the compelling opening. I think your insights into the market trend and momentum, especially around the project pipeline growth and investment in the hotspots, gave a really excellent grounding for today's dialogue. So let's now take some questions from our audience. So first of all, could you please help us explain to what extent is the growth of CCUS deployment influenced by the current geopolitical and economic instability? And how can stakeholders mitigate the associated risk?
Absolutely. That's a good question. There's lots in there, but it's a very topical question indeed. And I think, as I was saying, given the industry's reliance on government support and policies and things being in place, of course, changes to the geopolitical landscape and economic environment will impact project executions. And also, project lifetimes will span decades. Big projects can go over 50 years, so they need to be able to endure changes to governance over that time as well. If we take, for instance, the US as an example, the political landscape there has changed. And one of the things that was a bit concerning was what was going to happen to 45Q. This is really the bedrock of CCUS in the States, and what will happen to it under a new administration. But the sort of draft proposals found that it will remain largely intact under the new administration. There's a few changes, but it will mostly begin the same incentives will be there. So that's a really positive thing that we've seen even with experiencing these big changes. And in terms of mitigating risks, I think it's sort of your standard things, like companies should diversify their portfolios across different countries and regions to take advantage of the most favorable policy frameworks and the most favorable regulations in place as well. We've already seen companies begin to relinquish projects in countries where policy is maybe not advancing as fast as it was supposed to. And of course, as well, we've seen many companies forming joint ventures as well for high risk projects to sort of share some of the risks there too. So. Any other questions?
Sorry for the delay. So the second question is, with supporting infrastructure, including the interim or temporary storage, is being developed in parallel with CCUS project to facilitate the carbon dioxide utilization pathway?
Absolutely. So, CCS and CCU, they're being developed in tandem. They're both really important routes for decarbonisation. Currently, I know that our outlook for CCU is a lot lower than the CCS outlook. And I think, I can't remember the number exactly, but I believe it's around 10% of planned projects in our day-to-day SAR are using utilisation as the end route. In terms of supporting infrastructure, many CO2 hubs are providing routes for storage and also utilisation. And by CO2 hubs, I mean, TNS systems, which are shared infrastructure which multiple emitters can use. And many of those are also providing routes for utilisation. There's some projects in the UK, for instance, the South Wales Industrial Cluster, I believe, is also providing routes for utilisation. And also in Europe, there's lots of terminals coming up for importing and exporting CO2, whether they be closed or open access for multiple projects. And many of these are also going to be providing routes for utilisation. But again, the volumes are going to be considerably smaller than what's been sent for storage. But of course, there's infrastructure being developed in tandem in terms of hubs and terminals.
Thank you, Anastasia, and to all who contributed thoughtful questions to the Q&A session. I think that's a great start to today's program, and let's now explore how Europe is paving the way for cross-border carbon dioxide transport and storage. Thanks again, Ms. Anastasia. As one of the most active regions in carbon management, the European Union has been instrumental in shaping the policy framework to enable carbon dioxide transport and storage infrastructure. So in the next chapter, join us is Mr. Lukasz KOLINSKI, the Deputy Director General at European Commission, to share EU's latest efforts to support carbon dioxide transport and storage efforts that are really vital to meeting the climate goals while maintaining industrial competitiveness. So, Mr. KOLINSKI, welcome on stage.
Yes, hi everyone. I hope that you can hear me and see me well. There were some technical problems. Let me spend a few minutes, explaining to you our approach to CCUS, to industrial carbon management, and let me say first that I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share our commitment to support the development of CO2 transport and storage in the EU. Let me basically emphasize that the industrial carbon management is the key part of our decarbonization strategy. It's clearly reflected, in the strategic documents of the Commission. The new mandate of the Commission started a few months ago. There are clear political guidelines for this Commission. There are clear mission letters for the new commissioners, and the industrial carbon management is there as a tool to achieve our goal for 2050, which is being a climate neutral continent. Our modeling of the 2040 climate target communication shows that next to the renewables, next to energy efficiency, material efficiency, circularity, industrial carbon management is basically necessary to achieve our agreed objectives in the EU. And this modeling also indicates that in the initial phase, most captured CO2 is expected to be permanently stored in geological formations, and industrial carbon management technologies are needed to capture the remaining CO2 emissions, including process emissions from industry, and these technologies are also necessary to address the residual emissions that will persist. Heavy emitting industries are already developing decarbonization strategies, and industrial carbon management is central to coordinate these efforts. It will be necessary to match decarbonization and competitiveness in some industrial sectors. The drive for industrial carbon management is not only globally gaining ground, but also within the EU. One illustration is, for example, what happened in Denmark, which reached a significant milestone in June last year, and it awarded its first onshore CO2 storage exploration license. This progress was further reinforced this April with the granting of an additional license. And it's not only one member state out of 27, it's also, we see also action, concrete projects in other countries like the Netherlands, Italy, and also we see the development of a project pipeline elsewhere. Let me say a few words about the existing legislative framework and our plans for the future. The existing laws in the EU already address several aspects of the CO2 value chain, including storage and transport. And recent developments, both on the legislative and non-legislative side, have further advanced this agenda. One example is the Net Zero Industry Act, which set an ambitious target to make at least 50 million tons of CO2 storage capacity available annually by 2030. That's an ambitious goal, clearly. In this context, the Commission published last week a decision identifying 44 oil and gas companies required to contribute to the EU target based on the respective shares of crude oil and natural gas production within the Union. In parallel, stimulating the deployment of CO2 networks across the EU remains a priority. We have currently 14 projects of common interest and of mutual interest. These are the projects of cross-border scale, either between different member states of the EU or between the EU and the neighboring states related to CO2 transport. And these projects received over 600 million of European funding via the Connecting Europe facility, in addition to the earlier 250 million grants. The Porthos and Aramis projects in the Netherlands are one example and a good example of how the Connecting Europe facility supports projects in becoming a reality, with construction basically now underway. However, only a limited number of projects are being built today. And that's why we want to move further in terms of scaling up industrial carbon management technologies, facilitating the creation of a single market for CO2 in Europe. There were three challenges that our strategy for industrial carbon management highlighted. One is obviously the cost. The other one is market and regulatory fragmentation. We see quite a lot of barriers there. And the third one is the lack of coordination, which makes basically planning investments and the infrastructure development difficult, creates uncertainty and risks for project promoters. And to address these challenges, the strategy announced a legislative proposal to gradually establish a well-functioning internal market and infrastructure for CO2. And there are, again, three areas in which we are looking into while preparing such a package. The first one is barriers to cross-border CO2 transport. The second one is the emergence of a competitive CO2 value chain. And the third one is investor confidence and regulatory certainty across the whole chain. And we will look, and we are already looking into fostering cross-border interoperability. We are looking into the establishment of standards. We are looking into CO2 stream transport infrastructure. We're launching now pre-normative research with European standardization bodies to define minimum safety and integrity standards for CO2 streams. Regarding the second area, we plan to explore the need for tariff regulation, rules on third-party access, measures to avoid conflicts of interest, and an appropriate governance structure. And barriers to repurposing and facilitating permitting are also in the picture, because we would like to make sure that the build-out is not slowed down by complexity of permitting in this relatively new area. And finally, regarding investor confidence, we recognize the need for a clear long-term regulatory outlook while maintaining the flexibility necessary for this nascent market. And in this context, we're looking into issues related to coordinated infrastructure planning, fostering a more inclusive and effective environment for all involved actors. In parallel to this legislative effort, the European emissions trading system will continue to play a role in fostering CCUS projects. And under its review clause, the Commission is required to report by mid-next year and possibly propose update of the legislation on the integration of atmospheric CO2 removals into the ETS, as well as on how to account for captured and utilized CO2 in products. And this will be essential to establishing a robust business case for industrial carbon management, particularly with regard to negative emissions and CO2 utilization. And finally, the implementation of the strategy that I've been talking quite a lot about also contributes to the development of CO2 storage through the establishment of an investment atlas of potential CO2 storage sites across not only the European Union, but the whole European economic area. The Commission is additionally conducting a study to explore preliminary options for establishing a platform aimed at improving transparency around demand and available storage capacity. So, as you see, as a conclusion, I mean, there is no doubt of our commitment to the development and deployment of CCUS projects in Europe. there is no doubt that they will play a role in achieving our climate ambition, climate objectives. There is no doubt in our minds that urgent action is required to scale up the necessary technologies. And there is no doubt in our mind that the Commission alone will not do it, that we can do it in cooperation with the member states and with the stakeholders. And therefore, we are happy to participate in events like this. We are happy to engage actively with all the actors ahead of the legislative proposal that I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. KOLINSKI. I think your remark underscored EU's leadership in building a pan-European carbon dioxide value chain, especially from regulation to funding.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you anymore.
Hi, Mr. KOLINSKI, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you, yes.
I'm really sorry. I was trying to say, I think your remark really underscored EU's leadership in building a pan-European carbon dioxide value chain, especially from regulation to funding instruments. Let's move to the Q&A session. I think our audience are curious to have your answers on this. So first of all, could you please help explain how is the European Commission evaluating the advantages and disadvantages of different regulatory models for carbon dioxide transport infrastructure across its member states?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, whenever we prepare new legislative proposals, and this is also the case here, we follow a process which is called better regulation process, or the process of basically gathering evidence on different types of approaches, assessing different options, and we prepare the impact assessment for all these options. And this is normally based on various studies. And we are looking, we are supporting studies which will provide a detailed analysis of such various regulatory models and options for CO2 transport infrastructure. We are obviously, looking into a situation. We see a situation where you have different stages of market development in different countries, right? And we will take this into account because we want these regulatory approaches to be adapted to these stages. I mean, I mentioned Denmark. It's an example of a country which adopted an early phase approach, while some other countries have a particular focus on long-term market development. So we will, take this into account. We will take into account the geographic and economic realities in the member states, the potential for CO2 storage and transport. So, basically our approach is, very wide analysis at the beginning, very careful weighing of options, and then coming up with a legislative framework that basically is adaptable, is flexible, and that it basically is based on best practices out there.
Thank you, Mr. KOLINSKI. The second question for you is, in what ways does the European Union's CCUS transport strategy align with objectives or mechanism of EU Commission's trading system phase 2, also known as the ETS2?
Yeah, I mean, the CCUS is first and foremost about removing CO2 in the industrial sectors in which emissions are hard to abate. while ETS2 is about CO2 emissions from fuel combustion in buildings and road transport. And therefore, the industrial carbon management strategy and the scope of action that follow it is not immediately kind of focused on the ETS2 sectors. And obviously that doesn't make the CCUS less relevant for all the reasons that I did mention, as it has a key role in removing CO2 from from these processes that would otherwise pump it into the atmosphere. I mean, it's an obvious truth. So there is kind of no immediate, if you like, overlap, and I think there is certain complementarity between these instruments that you mentioned, but also other instruments that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you for all of your generous answers, Mr. KOLINSKI. I think it's very clear that EU is laying the foundation for a scalable cross-border carbon management infrastructure. And thank you so much for all of your contribution today.
Thank you.
And next, we head north to Norway. As a trusted storage hub for Europe, Norway's commitment to large-scale open access infrastructure is a model of both policy clarity and technological leadership. And next, we are really honored to welcome Mr. Lars Erik Emmel, the Director General of Norwegian Ministry of Energy, who will share how Norway is facilitating commercial storage at scale and advancing international cooperation through practice, like the flagship project Northern Lights. Please welcome Mr. Emmel. Mr. Emmel, can you hear me? You can turn on your camera and all the devices
Here we
now.
Go. So thank you for having me, and I'm pleased to share with you the plans we have in Norway for, that was wrong picture maybe, let me see. Here we go. So thank you for that introduction and for having me to share our perspective on being to facilitate large-scale CO2 storage for Europe at the Norwegian continental shelf. Norway has for decades worked on how to make CCS a viable option in combating global climate change. We have more than 30 years of experience in safe, permanent storage of CO2 offshore Norway at the Norwegian continental shelf, the NCS. That CO2 removed from the well stream at the Sleipner gas field in the North Sea and from the Snøhvit gas field in the up north, and which is connected to the Hammerfest LNG facility. These solutions was not chosen to enhance oil recovery. It was a way to permanent store CO2. CO2 used to enhance oil recovery, which is extensively used, for instance, onshore US, has not been evaluated to be economic viable at our offshore fields. Norway has, in parallel with the storage offshore, worked on the commercialization of capture technologies through R&D programs. And since 2012, through the Technology Center Mongstad, you can see on the screen. This center is the world's largest and most flexible test center for developing CO2 capture technologies and a leading competence center for carbon capture. In addition to that, a CO2 storage atlas, which we call it, with mapping of the storage potential at the NCS, was prepared and published by the Norwegian Offshore Directorate more than 10 years ago. In 2015, the next step started by studies on establishing a Norwegian full CCS value chain. And in 2021, the Norwegian government approved the development plan of such a value chain, the so-called Longship project. This project includes capture at a cement factory in southern Norway and possibly at a waste-to-energy facility in Oslo. And transport of CO2 with ships from these capture sites to a receiving facility with intermittent storage at Øygarden in western Norway. And from there, a pipeline from the receiving terminal to the offshore storage site. And on offshore, there is established 2 injection wells available. We call the transport receiving terminal and storage part of the Longship project as Northern Lights. And Northern Lights is able to store 1.5 million tons of CO2 yearly within phase 1. And first injection is planned to start up within weeks. The phase 1 of the Northern Lights project received significant public funding to go forward both on capital and operational costs. The main goal of the Northern Lights and the Longship project was to contribute to reduce long-term global CO2 emission by maturing CCS as a viable way to reduce global emissions. And doing that by showing that a CCS value chain works technically, and thereby also reduce risk for future projects around the world, and to help costs coming down through learning effects. And progress is made. Northern Lights has over the last years established additional commercial agreements to store captured CO2 from Ørsted in Denmark and from Yara in the Netherlands. And this spring, the owners of Northern Lights, Equinor, Shell and Total Energies, decided on commercial terms to go forward with a phase 2 of the storage project. Fundamentally important for the decision was a contract with Stockholm Exergi to store captured CO2 from a facility in Sweden. So as a result of development of phase 2, injection capacity will increase to 5 to 7 million tons of CO2 per year. And this development plan is for the time being under consideration in the ministry. Norway's economic structure and energy situation means that we have few large sources of CO2 emissions domestically. However, as I said, we have a huge potential for offshore CO2 storage, estimated by our offshore directorate to be tens of billions of tons. Because of this, Norway would like to offer large-scale commercial CO2 storage to European emitters, allowing them to reduce its emissions. And we have done progress on that as well. An efficient and well-working resource management policy for this storage potential has been established. Several licensing rounds for exploration licenses for CO2 storage has been held over the last years. These licensing rounds are based on an open door approach, where every company with relevant technical competence can apply for a license if they have an industrial plan that includes need for CO2 storage. And every license we award is awarded by a work program, securing that the companies mature their storage site or return the acreage to the state. All these work programs, which are typically 4 years long, have an investment decision and submission of a development plan as last stop. And we have, as the chart shows, we have since 2022 received many applications for licenses, and today 13 CO2 storage licenses are awarded at the NCS to a diverse group of companies. And we have one more round ongoing as we speak. You can see the diverse group of companies actively in CCS in Norway on the screen. And the group of companies within each and every license compete for customers in Europe that have a need for CO2 storage. So different transportation alternatives, including pipeline, is also under evaluation to find the most cost-efficient solutions. This competition among storage sites is also helping competitive storage costs for European emitters as we see it. To develop their storage sites, long-term economic commitments are needed from customers with CO2 to store. It's these emitters that need to pay for the storage service. As we see it, the main obstacle for companies going forward in maturing their storage sites and then finally take a possible investment decision is such firm long-term economic commitments from enough large European emitters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramo. I think your overview of Norway's regulatory clarity, geological advantages, international storage access is very encouraging for our regional scale-up. And now let's proceed to the Q&A session, which I believe our audience is seeking to have some of your available answers. So first of all, could you please help explain what are the next steps in Norway to incentivize the CCUS market, especially after the launch?
So on that question, we have kind of a two-way road, to put it that way. When it comes to, as I said in my intervention, that we have hardly any large emission sources in Norway due to our economic structure and that the electricity sector is 100% renewable. So that means that the utilization of the large storage potential at the shelf need to be CO2 from other countries with larger emissions that are available for capture and then storage. But the second kind of a path forward is to see if we can do more on the state side to subsidize domestic capture from additional type of smaller emission sources. So if there should be any incentive system, and that's worked on for the time being, to see if that's a way forward as well. So kind of a two path, one domestic and one storage, which is mostly a kind of an import of CO2 option or possibility.
Thank you, Mr. Ramo. The second question is, as we all know, as Norway opens new carbon dioxide storage listening rounds, what do you think is the government doing right now to attract and direct the private sector investment in this regard?
So as I also mentioned, that the state has kind of given, Norwegian state has given large subsidies to the Longship project and the phase 1 of Northern Lights. And that is seen in Norway as when it comes to large storage, commercial, that should be on commercial terms. So without subsidies from the Norwegian state. So the 13 licenses that are awarded, there's no question that they should be matured and developed on commercial terms. So that means that it is the polluter which has a problem that need to pay for the service at the end to have these storage sites developed. And that's, as I said, is mainly then must be, as you see on Northern Lights already, with customers in Sweden, Denmark, and Netherlands. That's, as we see it, also the way forward if this is going to be a big, a very large business going forward. So there need to be enough economic commitment, long-term commitment from polluters to pay for the service of CO2 storage to have these sites developed.
Yes. Thank you once again, Mr. Ramo, and for all of your candid insights and generous answers. And we look forward to meeting in person at our in-person summit, Carbon Capture Global Summit in London this September.
I look forward to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's now turn to Denmark, another rising CCUS leader in Europe. From North Sea to Copenhagen, Denmark is emerging as one of Europe's most ambitious carbon management innovators, with forward-thinking regulations and a national strategy geared towards market activation. Denmark is providing that scaling of carbon management is both a climate and industrial opportunity. We now welcome Dr. Anders Hoffmann, the Deputy Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utility, to present Denmark's pioneering approach to the regulatory innovations and market creation. So Dr. Hoffmann, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and allowing me to speak on the Danish approach. I think I have sort of divided my comments into three main boxes. I mean, first, the why, then the how, and then of course the what in the end. If we start with the why, well, basically we need carbon capture and storage globally. We need it to reach the Paris agreements, regionally in the EU. As you heard previously, it's a key priority for the EU in order to deliver on their priorities with the climate target. And of course, Denmark, in our national context, we have a very ambitious target of 70% reduction in 2030 compared to 19. And in order to deliver on those, carbon capture and storage is needed. That being said, of course, we're a big fan. It's a very important part of our climate policy. I think it's also important to stress that Denmark do believe that we should also invest in energy efficiency, expand our renewable, and really use the carbon capture and storage in the sectors where there are no other alternative or where the cost is too high. So clearly a very strong why for Denmark. If we look at the how, I think compared to Norway, I mean, we're sort of the new kids on the block in policy on this area. I think the first policy or the first political agreement on this was made in 2020. And I think in there, it really is what it was building on these three main pillars in the how. First of all, it was very clear from the outset that Denmark wanted to develop a market. We knew that it wouldn't be a market from the start, but all the policies that would put in motion needed to sort of follow up towards a market. The second thing we needed to do was really to develop the full value chain. So there was all this talk about the chicken and egg problem. Nobody wanted to develop a story if there's no capture. Nobody want to have a capture if there's no transport. So all of these challenges really needed to be addressed in our policy response. And then thirdly, we really needed to work very, very closely with the industry, given that we had the market approach. So industry needed to be very much in the room when we discussed the policy and what we needed to do, simply because all the challenges we have in the regulation, we can only learn about them as they're met by companies. So it's such a difficult areas to understand. So this dialogue with companies was really important. And then, of course, we really needed to do this fast. As I said, the first policies was in 2020, and we needed the reduction by 2030. So really working very fast. If I should go down to the what, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to say that there's been 10 major political agreements in Denmark. All of them have had great support from basically all parties in the Danish parliament. So there's a sort of a very strong political momentum behind it. Everybody believed in this market-based rollout of CCS. So currently now we are looking at about 5 billion euros in subsidies, which have been allocated to our subsidy schemes. I'll get back to them in a moment. And I think the aim now is to get 2.9 million tons captured and stored by 2030. So a very ambitious and very sort of expensive policy approach. First, if we should talk about the subsidy scheme. So the subsidy scheme was really designed to create the market, but really also to solve the chicken and egg problem. So what we did was that we said that, well, I mean, you can apply for a subsidy, you have to capture, you have to transport, and you have to store the CO2. So all of that had to be in the same bit. So we are only paying if people are actually storing the CO2. So you only get money if the thing works. And we did actually also include a fine. So if you're late on time or you don't store as much as you promised, you will actually have to pay money to the government. So this whole approach was really moving sort of the risk to the industries, which we thought would be better at managing them, but also giving them a 15 years contract where we would say we would be paying for the captured CO2 for 15 years, which would make the project very bankable for the industry. So the whole thing was really, we will create a bankable subsidy scheme and the company will manage the risk. And if it didn't work, the government wouldn't have to pay anything. So this was really how we tried to create a way to solve the chicken and egg problem. The first winner of the subsidy scheme was the Danish energy company called Ørsted, a very big company, basically very good, know what they're doing, and they're very much on track. So they would be opening the first capture plants later this year. And as you just heard from our Norwegian friends, they would be storing that CO2 in Norway. So that was the first subsidy scheme. The second subsidy schemes we made was a very clear price competition. Unfortunately, that didn't work so well. It was much shorter time range, and it was only for biogenic CO2. So in the third round, which we are currently in, we changed the subsidy scheme again. So now we are back to sort of a price competition, but with a pre-qualification. So companies had to show that they were capable, both from a financial perspective, but also from a technical perspective, to do that. 2 weeks ago, we announced 10 companies that would move on to the second phase of this bidding phase. So they would compete again mainly on the price. So what would we have to pay them for 15 years of stored CO2? So that's the subsidy scheme. The second thing we've really been very, very active on is storage. So in the early days of our policy, so in the 20s, we started looking at the old oil fields. We do have some oil explorations, oil and gas exploration in the North Sea, and we had some subsidy schemes to really try to examine whether they could be used for storage, and it turned out they could. So we had the first licensing round was really to store CO2 in the areas in the North Sea that Denmark have oil and gas exploration. That was the first round. The second round we did was onshore. So it's a very different approach from Norway. And the reason for that was basically Norway don't have a possibility to do that geologically. We do have that in Denmark. We have a very nice soil in Denmark. We have a very huge layer of clay. And beneath that clay layer, you have a lot of sand. And you have some very nice geological formation where that will allow you to store the CO2 on land. So we have 4 onshore licensing that are now issued, and we would have another 3 nearshore licensing within, that would be probably before the summer. All of these licenses are fully commercial. So it's a similar approach to the Norwegian one. So you compete on the program of work. When you're rewarded, you have years to develop. The Danish government have a 20% owner share of it. We have a special company called the North Sea Foundation. They are managing all the public sector's investment in oil and gas industry, and they're the same one we are using for carbon capture and storage. So hopefully we will have the first storage ready soon. There's one of the North Sea ones that will be ready either late this year or early next year. They have had all the tests available. They have taken final investment decision, so they should be good to go. We are hoping that at least 3 of our storage on land would be ready for the capture in 2030. So that's basically the time plan for that. We have also been very active in cross-border transportation and cross-border bilateral agreements. The reason for that is really that given we have so good facilities for storage, we're quite keen on being a CO2 hub for Europe. So we will import and store foreign CO2 in Danish soil. For 2 reasons. I think it has been important for the Danish Parliament that given that Denmark could give something to Europe to be part of the solution on climate change. And then secondly, we do also believe there's a huge economic scale in CO2 storage. So by storing more CO2, we would also, of course, lower the cost for the Danish emitters to do that. So I think with that, I would sort of sum up my conclusion saying that, I mean, the why, basically, we believe we needed the CO2, both for the target in 2030, but also if we look a bit ahead, Denmark have a target of being climate negative in 2050. And in order to do that, of course, we need to work with negative emission based on biogenic CO2. So there's a very clear why. The what, I mean, we are very keen on developing a market, very keen on working with the whole value chain, working with companies and working fast. And then as I just laid out, we have all of these many different policy approaches trying to aim at delivering on those targets. So I think with that, that was my very short overview of what's going on in Denmark, and happy to answer any questions related to that.
Thank you so much for such an informative presentation, Dr. Hofmann, and for highlighting Denmark's regulatory agility and ambition deployment framework. And let's now open up the Q&A session. So first of all, as we all know, with the first phase of the CCUS fund focused on large carbon resources or consortia, what criteria were used to select the first round of projects, and what lessons have emerged so far? Can you share us with that?
Yeah, I think the first round, it was sort of the main competition was on price. So basically, what would we have to pay the company in order to capture, transport, and store the CO2? So that was the main part of the competition. But we did also have some percentage points that was relating to the readiness of the project, given that it was very key for us to have project ready soon. So we were also given special points if you could sort of show that you already have the capability or that you were able to move especially fast. So I think we did actually think that the first round we had was quite successful. So in the designing of the latest round we have taken much of the things we learned from this first round, but we did change some aspects. One of the aspects we changed was that we have now a more sort of flexible penalty system. In the first one, it was actually quite harsh. You did have to pay a lot of money if you're late. So the fine is now less, and it's a more flexible way to paying it. We also have more flexibility on one of the things that companies are concerned about is, of course, what about the environmental assessment? What if that goes? What if that's late? So all of these things that can happen in the phase. So we are now slightly more flexible on the timelines. So if it's not your fault, then you're late, you can have postponed startup of the project. So we're a bit more flexible now in the third than we're in the first.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. So as we all know, just as you mentioned in your presentation, Denmark has definitely positioned itself as the European carbon dioxide hub. So could you please share more about how the country plans to collaborate with its regional neighbors on the cross-border carbon dioxide transport and storage?
Yeah, I think actually we were a bit surprised when we started working at it, and it turned out that you couldn't transport CO2 from one country to another and store it. So we had to sort of develop a framework for that, and we did that with the first country we did it was actually with Belgium, and we signed that. And since then we have had all of these bilateral agreements, and I think it's really been a push to work with our close neighbors and get those contracts ready. And we have also had many companies come and visit Denmark and really try to show them what are the possibilities to store in Denmark. But as I said, we strongly also believe that this is a commercial market, and I'm sure that the companies that do have license in Denmark are doing the very best they can in order to sell their storage to companies in other countries. And we work very closely with them in order to figure out which countries do Denmark need to have those bilateral agreements, and do we need to have special talks with other countries in order to help them understand the benefits of working with Denmark. So again, a very close cooperation. I think actually we have a meeting with all the storage today. So it's something we do on a regular basis.
Thank you once more, Dr. Hoffman. I think it's so much clear that Denmark's success rests on an integrated vision of innovation, regulation, and cross-border alignment. Thank you so much for all of your insights contribution to this webinar.
Thank you for having me.
So heading across Atlantic to Canada, a country that has combined vast geologic storage resources with strong technology capacities to become the first mover in CCUS. With approximately 1/8 of the world's large-scale carbon management project, Canada is using carbon management as a lever for both emission reduction and economic growth. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Cynthia Handler, Director General of Natural Resources Canada, as she outlined how Canada carbon management strategy is delivering climate action and clean growth. So Cynthia, the stage is yours.
Thank you. And I'm really happy to be among fellow leaders in carbon management and valuable partners to Canada in this space. I'm proud that Canada is also a global leader in carbon management, including both CCUS and carbon dioxide removal. And today I'll be speaking about Canada's strategy to scale up a world-class carbon management sector, building economic opportunities and delivering on our climate commitments. So in my presentation today, I'll speak about the role of carbon management in our priorities, federal supports for carbon management, subnational leadership, industry leadership, and international collaboration. Can I ask you to move to slide 2? Both aspects of carbon management, point source CCUS and carbon removal, will be essential tools in meeting net zero goals, both globally and in Canada. So Canada's new government will fight climate change, as highlighted last week in Prime Minister Mark Carney's mandate letter to his cabinet. And we have an ambitious 2030 climate plan and a legislated commitment to net zero by 2050. Our new Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Tim Hodgson, strongly reaffirmed that CCUS is a continued priority for the Government of Canada in a keynote speech last week in Alberta, one of our leading jurisdictions on CCUS and a key partner. Canada is prioritizing nation-building projects, which could include investments in carbon capture infrastructure to ensure heavy industries such as oil and gas are produced responsibly and globally competitively. Canada's emissions reduction plan seeks to avoid emissions wherever possible, while leveraging carbon management technologies where necessary to mitigate and remove emissions. So carbon management is part of a broader toolkit, which also includes a focus on electrification, clean fuels, and low carbon hydrogen. And carbon management is especially key to reducing emissions in our toughest to abate heavy industry sectors such as cement, steel, chemicals, and oil and gas. We expect carbon management technology to show up across all scenarios to meet 2030 and 2050 goals. So, for example, in the scenario here from Canada's energy regulator, there's projects a significant amount of DAC and VEX to reach net zero by 2050. Slide 3. Canada has been an early leader in carbon management space for decades. The country is fortunate to have natural advantages, with some regions having abundant geology suitable for CO2 storage. And we have a strong foundation of expertise with leadership from industry, researchers, and government. We also benefit from a competitive policy environment and enabling regulatory frameworks, with important incentives and project supports from provincial and the federal government. Thanks to the strong policy support, natural advantages, and expertise, Canada's carbon management sector has already made major progress. As you heard earlier, Canada is home to 8 of the 65 commercial CCUS projects operating around the world today, and ranks 3rd globally in the number of projects in development, including positive final investment decisions on projects by Shell, ATCO, Npower, Wolf Midstream, Entropy, Air Products, Lind, and Dow. Point source capture rates of over 90% have been demonstrated at commercial scales in Canada, and innovative Canadian companies are receiving global recognition, such as the Global Clean Tech 100 and X Prize. And we're now seeing some significant partnerships, acquisitions, and foreign direct investment in the sector. Slide 4, please. We have a lot of Canadian firms working in this space, spanning the entire carbon management value chain, from carbon capture, transport, utilization to storage. We're seeing new firms created that leverage the talent and expertise of existing industries, including the oil and gas sector. And we're seeing new partnerships and cross-sector collaborations form, which are enabling the development of carbon management hubs. Slide 5, please. With all of this activity, it's an exciting time for carbon management in Canada. We released the carbon management strategy in September 2023 after significant public engagement with nearly 1,500 stakeholders, including industry, experts, subnational governments, Indigenous organizations, and other stakeholders. The strategy set a vision to realize the potential of carbon management to help achieve climate goals and growing a multi-billion-dollar domestic sector with good jobs. To achieve this vision, the strategy presents a roadmap to 2050, with milestones for 2030, 40, and 50. At each step, carbon management solutions continue to mature, driven by innovation and investment, and opening new opportunities to reduce and remove emissions. The strategy identifies 5 low-carbon pathways where carbon management is expected to play an important role, including decarbonizing heavy industry, cement, steel, oil and gas, producing low-carbon hydrogen, clean power generation, carbon dioxide removal to address residual and historic emissions, so DAC, VEX, enhanced mineralization, and growing CO2-based industries that can use CO2 in products and materials. The strategy also outlines 5 federal priorities to support these pathways, which are accelerating innovation in RD&D, advancing policies and regulations, attracting investments in trade, scaling up projects in infrastructure, and building partnerships and growing inclusive workforces. Slide 6, please. So Canada is using a range of policy tools to accelerate the development and deployment of carbon management solutions as part of a broader clean energy framework. At the foundation is a rising industrial carbon price on carbon and regulations to incent innovation and decarbonization investment. This includes an offset credit system and clean fuel regulations, which provide compliance options and potential revenue for carbon management projects. Canada is also introducing a suite of investment tax credits to help address capital costs of projects. Tax credits for CCUS, clean electricity, and clean hydrogen will provide opportunities for carbon management. The CCUS ITC is a refundable tax credit for eligible capital expenditures, anticipated to provide more than $7.5 billion in support by 2030. It includes tax credit rates of 60% for direct air capture, 50% for other capture equipment, and 37.5% for transport, storage, and use equipment.
Right, and then you're offline.
Yes.
May I?
Hello. Okay, rates are currently set through 2030 and will have in 2031 to incentivize action. However, on the campaign trail, our new elected government sent a strong signal about the potential for the full value of the CCUS ITC to be extended from 2030 to 2035. To be eligible, carbon must be permanently stored in geology or concrete, and regulatory frameworks to support safe and permanent geological CO2 storage are in place and in development in multiple provinces. So eligible jurisdictions so far are Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC, with regulations in place, and jurisdictions expected to become eligible as their regulatory frameworks are in development are Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba. Moving further up this pyramid, we have a number of tools support strategic financing, including the $15 billion Canada Growth Fund, which is providing carbon contracts for difference, among other financing tools, and has already announced support for several CCUS project developers like Svante, Strathcona Varma, and Mtpa. As well, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank provides strategic financing. And finally, we have targeted programs, including a targeted investment in RD&D of $319 million through the CCUS RD&D program that I'm responsible for. And last but not least, the Government of Canada is advancing a $10 million commitment to procure high-quality carbon dioxide removal services, boosting demand for the technologies and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from government operations. Slide 7, please. In addition to federal measures, subnational governments or provinces are also contributing to Canada's strong policy and investment environment. Alberta has many incentives, like its carbon pricing system, funding support, and its CCUS hub development process. BC and Saskatchewan are also early movers, and both are home to world-leading projects and innovators. And on our East Coast, Canada has significant offshore geologic storage potential that Nova Scotia and Newfoundland are exploring for carbon storage hubs, with the ability to leverage their oil and gas sectors and leading tech firms. Slide 8, please. Canada's consistent federal and provincial support for government carbon management is driving real momentum and laying the groundwork for a healthy carbon management sector. This is clearly seen in the ongoing development of hubs in Alberta. A leading example is the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, or ACTL, that has become part of the backbone infrastructure supporting carbon capture in Canada. This 240-kilometer CO2 pipeline links capture and storage sites and is being designed with excess capacity to allow for more facilities to connect in the future. Now being expanded with the 40-kilometer Edmonton connector, which will transport CO2 from a net zero hydrogen energy complex currently under construction. To scale up, the Alberta government continues to allocate carbon sequestration rights through a competitive process, with over 20 hub proposals currently being evaluated and 2 approved hubs, Atlas and Bison, that have been allocated carbon sequestration rights. Slide 9, please. Canada also prioritizes international collaboration and engagement as part of our approach to developing the carbon management sector. We've got a long history of sharing information and best practices from successful projects like Weyburn-Midell and Boundary Dam, Saskatchewan, or Quest in Alberta. We participate in international carbon management forums to facilitate this exchange. We are currently the North American representative on the steering committee of the Carbon Management Challenge, which aims to advance a pipeline of carbon management projects by 2030 that will reach gigaton scale. This was launched in 2023. The challenge has assembled a coalition of 23 governments, including the European Commission so far, to advance this goal. Canada is a member of the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, supporting knowledge exchange and development of best practices and policies, regulations, and project development. And we're the co-lead of Mission Innovation CDR mission, with efforts underway to develop approaches for CDR lifecycle analysis, techno-economic analysis, monitoring, verification, and reporting. Last slide. So to conclude, I hope what you take away from this presentation is that in Canada's new government, carbon management technologies remain an essential pillar of Canada's climate plan and clean economy strategy, and Canada's new government has been clear in its continued strong support for the sector. Canada's consistent support from federal and provincial governments in the development and deployment of carbon management technologies continues to make Canada a leading jurisdiction. Canada is implementing its carbon management strategy that sets a vision and roadmap for 2050, supported by clear priorities and concrete action. Industry, subnational, and Indigenous partners are providing strong leadership and building partnerships, and Canada will continue to support international collaboration to realize the potential of carbon management and achieving our collective climate goals. So thank you very much for your time, and apologies for the technical issues that did not allow me to connect by video today.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think your address clearly showed how carbon management in Canada is both a climate imperative and a growth engine in the world. So you're welcome to your questions in the following session. First of all, could you please help explain what role does the government see CCUS playing in attracting foreign direct investment and creating jobs in the region dependent on heavy industry or natural resources?
This is an important question. As private capital plays an essential role in advancing carbon management technologies in Canada, and government action can facilitate it. CCUS and CDR are more than just climate solutions. Our Prime Minister has publicly referred to CCUS as key to industrial competitiveness and pointed to its ability to create an entirely new industry that will serve Canadians well, creating jobs, exports, and opportunities for many decades. Developing these projects is a way to attract foreign capital and good domestic jobs, especially in provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, that have a larger share of the country's heavy industries like cement, steel, and oil and gas. So carbon management is really not just about cutting emissions, it's about building a competitive, future-ready economy for Canada. And we believe it can attract capital into regions with heavy industry because global demand for low-carbon products and energy continues to increase, and it allows these regions to remain competitive.
Yes, thank you, Cynthia. As just you mentioned in your presentation, approximately 1/8 of the world's large-scale carbon management projects are currently in Canada. So with that exciting circumstances, what lessons has Canada learned from this early deployments, and how are they informing new projects in the following process?
So Canada has really demonstrated a strong history of sharing information and best practices to help pave the way for successful projects and help other countries hit the world running. So the Weyburn-Midell project in Saskatchewan is the world's first cross-border carbon project. And from 2000 to 2012, it hosted an international research initiative to study geological CO2 storage. That was sponsored by the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D program and a consortium of government and industry. And that research culminated in a publicly available best practices manual that can accelerate the learning curve in new projects that wish to store CO2 outside of their own borders. And it also provides an incredible opportunity to understand the long-term performance of geological storage. Right next door to Weyburn-Midell, the Boundary Dam is the world's first carbon capture power generation project. That led to the establishment of the International CCUS Knowledge Center, which is a partnership between BHP and SaskPower that's really dedicated to advancing large-scale CCUS projects. In Alberta, Quest and the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line have together stored about 14 megatons of CO2. They provide valuable first-of-a-kind knowledge to pave the way for future projects. For example, Shell's final investment decision for the Polaris project and the Atlas Hub build on Quest, while Wolf's 40-kilometer Edmonton connector leverages ACTL. These Canadian operating projects like Quest, the Alberta Trunk Line, Boundary Dam are sharing valuable knowledge to the international community as well. And further, we've committed to knowledge sharing on carbon management through the CCUS ITC, which requires large projects over 250 million to share reports publicly. So this can support future CCUS deployment around the world. So recent positive final investment decisions on projects by Shell, ACO, npower, Wolf Midstream, Mtpa, Air Products, Linden Dow can provide support for international momentum. I would say that the lessons learned are also identified from project front-end engineering and design FEED studies. And thanks to Emissions Reduction Alberta and the CCUS Knowledge Center, with our support, they've published a report last month with key learnings from 11 CCUS FEED studies in Alberta. So all of that would be accessible to the listeners here.
All right, thank you to all of your detailed explanation, Ms. Handler. And thank you to all of our audience, even though we are unfortunately unable to join by video today. But I believe you are sending a strong, marked signal to the world on behalf of Canada, especially with project ramping up and new policy incentive in place. And thanks again for your participation, Ms. Handler. Turning to Asia-Pacific region, we began with Singapore, a small country with big CCUS ambitions. As the first nation in Southeast Asia to outline a national CCUS strategy, Singapore is charting the path forward for regional collaborations and industrial decarbonizations. In the next chapter, please welcome Mr. Oh Kai-on, the Director of Carbon Mitigation of Singapore's Ministry of Trade and Industry, who will share Singapore's next steps and the visions for a viable CCUS future. So, Kai, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening here from Singapore. I'm glad to be given this opportunity by Leaders Associates to share on this topic on carbon sequestration, which I think everyone here in the audience see as a critical decarbonization pathway. And I'm here to share what Singapore is trying to do, along with some of our Asian neighbors, in making our own progress here in CCS in this part of the world. And I think collectively we're recognizing this as a role in CCS role in achieving net zero. I just wanted to check whether my slides and I can be heard before I proceed. I'll take the silence as a yes. If you could go back to the prior slide, please. So Singapore's had just recently submitted our BTR, and in it, we've also renewed our pledge for our NDC, specifically for our 2035 ambition, which is to bring our emissions to between 45 and 50 million tons per annum of CO2. This is our total national emissions. If you could go to the next slide. This is our emissions profile in Singapore. It's as no surprise, as a small urban island state. Most of our emissions come primarily from our industry and our power sector. We don't have a significant agricultural-based or land-use-based emission profile. A lot of our industries, as you would note later, are in manufacturing, so some of them can be rather heavy industries and in some cases hard to abate, and therefore that's where CCS comes into the picture. If you could go to the next slide, please. As a small nation and a country that has limited natural resources or even land for wind, for even offshore wind or solar, we have to be quite creative and diversified in how we choose and select our decarbonization measures. We don't have one extremely big lever. But in the medium term, for us to get to our 2030 and subsequently our 2035 NDC, we are approaching decarbonization on several fronts. First, CCS, primarily for our hard-to-abate sector in the first phase. We are looking actively into electrification where it makes sense, as well as fuel switch. There, the potential is not extremely high. Even as of today, Singapore's primary energy source is natural gas. It takes up 95% of our energy mix here in Singapore for both power and industrial use. And natural gas at least as a fossil fuel, is one of the cleanest that we can get. So areas to pivot to would be things like biofuels, which I'll touch on in the second slide. Third measure that we're looking at is lowering of our non-GHG industrial emissions, whereby I mean non-CO2 GHG gas emissions. So some of these would come from sectors like the semicon industry. The fourth measure that we're looking at is increasing solar deployment. Again, as I mentioned earlier, due to our small land mass, even if we push solar to its limit, we're expecting only about 2,000 megawatt peak by 2030, which is quite a small amount of our energy mix. Fifth would be driving industrial energy efficiency as much as we can, both in terms of process industry and other hard-to-abate sectors. And finally, we're adopting, where we can, the most efficient and best-in-class technologies for our combined cycle gas turbines for our power plants. And we're also retrofitting them to be able to take on up to 30% hydrogen when hydrogen becomes readily available in our part of the world. And finally, we're looking at importation of green electrons from regional countries. Next slide, please. We will also continue to trial and scale more nascent low-carbon energy pathways to unlock and spur infrastructure investments in areas like biomethane, novel fuel cell technologies paired with CCS. We're looking at vertical or building integrated PV, as well as novel, I would say, electron carriers like ammonia and hydrogen. So these are some of the things that we're doing over and above what we intend to do in CCS. Next slide, please. A lot of our decisions on what pathways to take and whether we would pull the trigger on CCS is guided by our marginal abatement cost curve, as is illustrated on this slide. And a lot of it would determine on where our NDC line is, as demarcated in the green dash line in the screen in front of you. And that would then give us what we loosely term as our shadow carbon price. And that should guide investment decisions on whether government would come in to activate certain decarbonization pathways. CCS lies within the green dotted line, and that's something that we will continue to pursue. Meanwhile, we'll continue to invest in R&D to try to find ways to add new mitigation measures, to reduce costs of existing mitigation measures, and for existing mitigation measures to find a way to scale them so that the mitigation impact is increased. Next slide, please. I think I'm preaching to a room of converts, so this is one of the least important slide. I think everyone in the room would agree that CCS is a promising solution to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors, as proven by multiple reports and international bodies such as the IEA and also reports from the IPCC. Next slide, please. How we are going to be doing it in Singapore is to develop CCS value chain in two phases. In phase one, we're really aiming to have 2 to 2.5 million tons of CO2 to be exported to a willing storage country. In phase one, the government will select and support our foundation emitters to make up that 2 to 2.5 million tons per annum of CO2. And as of March this year, we have launched a competitive request for proposal to identify investors who would come in to invest in an onshore aggregation facility here in Singapore, and also to find people who are private companies that are interested in providing transport and long-term storage services to emitters in Singapore. So that's phase one. Yeah, thank you. Our future plans would hopefully bring CCS as a decarbonization pathway well into 2035 and beyond. And if you look at our 2050 net zero scenario, we see a potential of CCS helping us abate up to 20 million tons per annum of CO2, not just from industry, but also from our waste sector, as well as our power sector. Next slide, please. So in phase one, this is probably where action is going to be taking place. What you see here is an aerial shot of one of our industrial complexes. This is a small island adjacent to Singapore. It's still part of Singapore, and this is where many of our process, refinery, and chemical sector is, and that is Singapore's hard-to-abate sector. And this is where most of our point source emissions from our hard-to-abate sectors would come from. Next slide, please. This is an illustration. So this is a Google map bird's eye view of that same photo that I showed previously. This is where we intend to, this is how we intend to roll out the CCS infrastructure needed, at least on the Singapore side. So this is an illustration of the export facility that we'll need to build, the common CO2 trunk lines that emitters would then inject into. And we're already beginning the process of identify where the phase one of the emitters would come from, and where likely phase two emitters would come in our second phase. Next slide, please. In terms of timeline, we are now at Q2 2025. As I mentioned earlier, the RFP has been launched as of March. What we hope to do is for the RFP to trigger pre-FEED, pre-front-end engineering design, and to get cost estimates, as well as for us to assess the technical viability together with industry. We hope to come to a conclusion of the RFP sometime in Q2 2026, where we finalize the value chain partners, the CCS parties, and the site that would then move into front-end engineering design FEED. And that would take approximately a year, after which a final investment decision would be made sometime in second half 2027. And we hope to commence construction shortly after, with the aim of injecting the 2 million tons per annum by 2030. Next slide, please. As we go through the CCS project, I mean, we are quite clear-eyed, and we have been learning from folks such as Norway, the Netherlands, and the UK, that the government's role in deploying CCS will be non-trivial. In the case of the Singapore government, we see ourselves playing 6 different roles. First, to provide partial funding, and we intend to get the funding source from our Carbon Pricing Act that was in place since 2018, collecting money since 2019. Second, as this is first of its kind project for Singapore and potentially for the greater Southeast Asia and Oceania region, we see ourselves as the project originator to define the value chain, identify potential private sector investors, operators, and to also onboard emitters. Our third role is to understand the cross-chain risk, review the allocation of those risks, and where it can't be borne by private sector, to step in to underwrite residual risk as a government. Number 4, we provide long-term certainty for capital-intensive investment, which is which is the segment that CCS falls under. We look to see whether, as government, we should underwrite, extend concessionary loans, or provide equity investments into certain parts of the value chain. Fifth, one important role that the government will have to play would be to collaborate with like-minded countries. Singapore does not have our own storage sites. We would have to be dependent on countries that have the ambition to be CCS hubs. And we are in dialogue as we speak with the likes of Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia. And therefore, as part 6, we have to then come together bilaterally to ink G2G agreements that will ensure a transparent, accountable border transfer of CO2, right? That is aligned to international norms and can stand up to international scrutiny. Next slide, please. These are some of the, as I mentioned earlier, we are talking to potential partner countries, and these are some of the MOUs and letter of intent that we have signed over the past 12 months. Next slide, please. Many of these G2G agreements, we try to take dressing from MOUs that have already been signed in Europe. One key difference, of course, is the fact that at least within ASEAN for the moment, there isn't a common EU ETS equivalent. And some of these would then have to be taken bilaterally in a G2G. And we think the elements of the G2G would have to encompass things like clearly defined handover point of the CO2, alignment and adherence to national greenhouse gas inventory reporting, and in most cases, alignment with how IPCC is dictating how those accounting should be done in our national inventory. The G2G would also allow for certain data to be exchanged so that we, as two countries in the agreement, we can be separately responsible and quite transparent in how the CO2 has been moved, measured, and stored. And finally, some elements of a dispute resolution agreement, given that some of these agreements would stretch multiple years, and this is a new value chain, and I'm pretty sure it will spring surprises along the way, and there has to be an amicable resolution pathway within our G2G to sort things out so that commercially, the commercial contracts that ride on this G2G can continue to proceed and CO2 continues to be transferred across borders. Next slide, please. We are also working closely with like-minded countries like Japan, Korea, as well as storage countries on how we can collaborate further to continue to ensure that there's public support for CCS. I think that just as there are many people in this room that are supportive of CCS as a credible decarbonization pathway, I think there's always another room that decries CCS. So there's always work to do in terms of working together to garner public support for CCS. And finally, coming together on common standards that will help create a more robust and a more resilient cross-border CCS ecosystem and network here in Asia. I think that's my last slide. Thank you so much for your time.
Yikai, I think your insights on the cross-border transport, geological assessment, and the public-private partnership has greatly showcased Singapore's programmatic approach. And now let's take some really interesting questions from our live audience who are seek to have your further guidance. First of all, could you please explain how and what has the Singaporean government been learning from other policy models when developing its own CCS policy?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think we've been fortunate to have learned from other countries and other government agencies. I think one aspect that we've come to understand from countries like Norway, Netherlands, the UK, is commercially it's important for governments to step in to plan the projects, because this is still, first, CCS is quite nascent. And the business case as yet is not clear to private sector, and that's where government would then need to step in. Singapore has also chosen to step in because we see this as one of the critical pathways for us to meet our NDC. So we are the project developer. We are the project originator, right? And so it does mean that we take an outsized role in bringing the relevant parties to the table. One other thing that we've also been learning is the issue of cross-chain risk. I think it's an extension of my earlier point. This is a fairly long chain, and in the case of Singapore, it's a chain that is not only within the territories of Singapore. It will be transboundary and cross-border. And I think some of these risk and cross-border risk would similarly be unearthed and uncovered as Europe also opens up to cross-border CO2 chains. So that's one other thing that we have been learning. So, for example, we have learned from the UK how we should be protecting against, I would say, demand risks by the revenue support agreements. And we've also been studying how they've set up their low carbon contract company, which is backed by the UK government, to provide assurance to private sector on counterparty risks and so on and so forth. I think on the G2G front, I think there's still a lot more learning to do. I think, as I pointed out earlier, in the case of Singapore, we've not have the good fortune of an EU ETS. So I think we are really treading into uncharted waters in terms of coming up with the G2G. But I think we're optimistic. I think our neighboring countries do also see CCS as important to their own NDC. CCS as a way for them to also decarbonize their own domestic hard-to-abate sectors. So I think with an alignment of interests and an alignment of what CCS means to them, I think we'll be able to iron out something in the G2G, hopefully in the near future. Yeah.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Kai. In terms of the G2G considerations that you just mentioned, could you please help us first explain what role does international collaborations or technology transfer play in accelerating Singapore's adoption of carbon management solutions such as CCUS and energy optimization?
Yeah, I think international collaboration is really important. I think beyond what I've already shared in my earlier response, that sharing of information and how we've been benefactors as Singapore to the generosity of the likes of Norway and the Netherlands in sharing their past experience as they came up with Northern Lights and Porthos. I think that itself is international collaboration, right? Being able to be forthcoming in what they have learned along the way as being the trendsetter for the rest of the world. I think in other areas of collaboration, I think there's still synergies to be had, especially in research. I think carbon capture cost remains an incredibly expensive part of the value chain, especially as you go into lower concentrated CO2 streams. So I think there's lots to be done in collaborating on R&D. For Singapore, international collaboration is also critical, right? Without it, we wouldn't have CCS at all because we don't have our own storage sites. So again, it is important for countries like Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia to be receptive to CO2 imports into their country, where they hope to maximize their incredible storage potential found in their country. So I think international collaboration is absolutely critical, especially for cross-border CCS.
Yeah. Thank you once again, Kai, for his insightful overview and professional answers to all these questions. I think there is no doubt that Singapore's data-driven collaborative approach of developing CCS will serve as a perfect model for others in the region. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
And now it comes to the final stop of our webinar today. Let's wrap up with Japan, where momentum is building around domestic commercializations and cross-border CCS value chain, a critical element for the region's decarbonization. We are really honored to have Mr. Tatsuya Tarazawa of Institute of Energy Economics, Japan, who will outline Japan's strategies for enabling industrial commercializations and international carbon dioxide flows across APAC.
Okay.
So, Mr. Tarazawa, welcome on stage.
Yeah, thank you very much. Shall we upload these slides, or would you be uploading the slides?
Can you please try to advance the slides?
I'll try. Okay. Do you see the slides? Do you see the slide? Okay.
Yes, we can see you pretty well.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. My name is Tatsuya Terazawa. I'm the chairman and CEO of the Institute of Energy Economics Japan. I'm honored to be the last speaker in this excellent presentation. I would like to touch upon Japan's policy towards CCS and our collaboration with our Asian neighbors. Let me first share with you why CCS is important for us in Japan. The government of Japan has established the Strategic Energy Plan in February of this year. And according to that Strategic Energy Plan, if we look at the Japan's final energy demand towards 2040, we expect that through electrification, 31 to 39% of the energy will be supported by electricity. But the remaining part, 61% to 69%, will be coming from non-power. And as we also look at Japan's power generation, we expect that in 2040, we still expect 30% to 40% of our power generation coming from thermal power. So one of our major challenges for Japan in order to decarbonize our whole economic system and energy system is how can we decarbonize the non-power sector and also the thermal power generation. We believe that CCS will play a very important role in the decarbonization of the non-power sector, basically the industrial sector and transportation sector, and also the thermal power generation. This is the picture of our CO2 reduction plan strategy we have. Our goal is to reduce our CO2 emission by more than 60% between 2022 towards 2040. In order to decarbonize our society, we'll certainly be deploying renewable energies and also deploying nuclear. By the way, Japan still has a lot of nuclear power plants which are still offline after Fukushima. So far, 14 nuclear reactors have been put back to online. We still have 19 nuclear reactors waiting for coming back online. So we'll be working on nuclear, and also we'll be working to expand hydrogen and ammonia. But still, we will depend on a significant scale the decarbonization to be helped by CCS. This shows the grand picture of our CO2 reduction in which CCS plays an important role. With the recognition that CCS is so important for us, last year in May, the Japanese government had the CCS Business Act, which governs the CCS activities within Japan, and the act was passed through our Congress or Parliament last year. And we understand this is one of the few legal frameworks specifically for CCS business in the world after EU, Austria, Norway, and the UK. The major items of our CCS Business Act consists of licensing system for exploration and storage projects, and regulation for storage operations, and safety regulations related to storage and transportation of CO2. So this governs provides the legal framework for conducting CCS business within Japan, but we still don't have the policy support to support CCS activities, which remain to be very expensive, especially in the initial stages. So now the government of Japan is now under consideration to develop the policy support system for CCS businesses. In the meantime, the Japanese government has supported 9 projects for feasibility studies, 5 of them within Japan, domestic, and 4 of them overseas. As for the 4 overseas projects, 3 are related with Malaysia, 1 is related to Oceania, basically Australia. The reason why we are pursuing both domestic and overseas is that in terms of transportation, it will be much better if we can store this CO2 nearby. And we believe that there is a potential for storage of CO2 in the vicinity of Japan. But at the same time, in terms of the scale of CO2 storage and the availability of the data required for CO2 storage, it is realistic for us to pursue overseas projects, which we can capitalize on the existing data, especially surrounding the dry gas fields or oil fields. So this is the reason why we're pursuing both domestic and international CCS projects. And within Japan, we are pursuing two approaches. One is using pipelines, and the other using shipping, even within Japan. So we are pursuing multiple pathways for CCS within Japan and internationally, and with pipelines and with shipping. Because as of now, we don't know the right answer to pursue CCS. So we are trying multiple pathways to see which path would be the most realistic and effective for us. This is a timeline for the commercialization of CCS projects we have in mind. The ultimate goal is to have the start of commercial CCS activities in the fiscal year 2030. By the way, the fiscal year in Japan starts in April, so we hope to start the commercial operation of CCS by March 31st of 2031. To make that happen, we are now at the final stage of developing the support system for CCS, and the basic image to have a CFD, a counter for difference kind of approach to support CCS activities. And after finalizing the support system, we'll put the necessary amendment of the laws to our Diet or our Parliament early next year. And after enacting the necessary law, we expect the first CFD support award to be provided within fiscal year 2026. And following that CFD or Counter for Difference award, we expect the FID for the projects will take place by the end of fiscal year 2026, which will be March 31st, 2027. And after that, we allow for 3 or so years for construction. And through that construction, we expect the first commercial CCS activities for Japan to be started by the end of fiscal year 2030. That's the timeline we have in mind. I talked about some of the feasibility studies going on, and this Tomakomai CCS project, which is now taking place in Hokkaido. Hokkaido is our northern island among our 4 major islands. This project started back in 2016, and now we are in the FS stage. This area has been designated as CCS operation area by METI. METI is the ministry responsible for energy and industry. We expect the FID to be concluded in fiscal year 2026, with the operation to start in fiscal year 2030. The emissioner of CO2 is the petroleum refinery and the coal power plant in the Tomakomai region, and the CO2 will be transported to the nearshore, offshore of Tomakomai, and be stored underground. So this is a domestic project that is going ahead. And we expect to capture 1.5 to 2.0 million tons of CO2 per year at this project. I talked about the support system, and the basic image is to have a CFD or contract for difference kind of system. This system or framework supports the cost difference between the cost for CCS and the cost for CO2. And we expect, especially at the early stages, this cost differences to be substantial. And this is where the government of Japan is committed to provide the support to fill in this gap to ensure that the CCS projects can go ahead. I mentioned the cost of CO2, and as of now, the carbon pricing in Japan is still underdeveloped. The only carbon pricing we have in Japan as of now goes back to 2012, when we introduced a modest carbon tax, about $2 per ton of CO2. But now, with Japan's pledge to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, we are engaged in the development of carbon pricing in a much fuller degree. Step 2, which is a step now we are going ahead now, is to introduce a mandatory ETS, emission trading system. The necessary bill is now deliberation at the Diet or our parliament now, and we expect the passage of this bill very soon, and we expect this mandatory ETS to be put into effect in the fiscal year 2026. We have already engaged in 3 years of voluntary ETS, but this will take us to a mandatory ETS system very soon. Since the ETS would only cover the major emitting industries, we expect to cover the 300 to 400 leading CO2 emissioners in Japan, probably covering 60% of our CO2 emission in Japan, but we need to cover the remaining parts. And that is the reason why we have step 3, carbon surcharge, which would cover everyone using fossil fuel. So these mandatory ETS and carbon surcharge will be the 2 pillars of carbon pricing in Japan. The mandatory ETS initially would start with free allocation of allowances, emission allowances, but in 2033, the plan is to introduce auctioning for emission allowances for power sector. And this is the time frame we expect for carbon pricing. So as we introduce carbon pricing, we can have the CFD in place as we have the cost of carbon to be decided through this mandatory ETS and carbon surcharge. As I discussed, we don't expect that we can do every CCS within Japan. We have to go international. And the logical step is to have CO2 shipping to other countries internationally. But the international norm requires a framework. There are 2 approaches. The first one is to approve the 2009 amendment to the London Protocol. And having CO2 shipping to the member country of this London Protocol is one way. But for those countries which are not members to this amendment, these countries under this London Protocol would have to introduce an equivalent domestic legal framework. This would include obligation to protect the maritime environment and introducing a permission system for offshore CO2 storage, and requires the framework for monitoring plan of stored CO2. And we will also need to have a bilateral agreement or arrangement. We are now in the process of providing technical assistance to Asian countries so that we can have international CCS by CO2 shipping to some of our Asian friends. Since Asia is very important for us, and as I said, we depend upon international storage of CO2 in addition to our domestic storage of CO2, we are working with our Asian countries for collaboration. Multilaterally, we have established the Asia CCUS network, and it has been in operation to share knowledge of the best practices through a forum and workshops. And we engage in research on technologies, economics, and legal systems related to CCUS. And also we engage in human resource development and capacity building on a multilateral level through the Asia CCUS network. At the bilateral level, with receiving countries, we have engaged in feasibility studies with Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Australia. And we are conducting monitoring project in Australia and transport study with Malaysia. And with emitting countries, we are engaged with the MOC, with the Singapore, to share the best practices for CCS operations. We are learning a lot from each other. This is the final slide. In addition to physically shipping CO2, we recognize that we can use cross-border credit as well. Cross-border credit became feasible by the Paris Accords Article number 6. Japan has already introduced a system we call JCM, or Joint Credit Mechanism, to have a cross-border credit mechanism amounting to 100 million tons of CO2 credit by 2030 and 200 million tons of CO2 credit by 2040. We have started feasibility studies for this JCM for CCS with Indonesia and Thailand, and we have developed the relevant guidelines to include CCS as part of this JCM, the bilateral carbon credit sharing mechanism, we agreed with Indonesia. And as I explained, Japan will be introducing the mandatory ETS system, which we call a GX ETS system in fiscal year 2026. So this cross-border credits through the JCM can be monetized through our GX ETS systems. So these efforts, policy put together, we envision that we can push the CCS activities in Japan and with our friends in Asia, so that we can decarbonize our economic system and energy system to achieve our pledge to realize carbon neutrality by 2050. So this concludes my presentation, and I would like to accept questions from the audience and the moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Tadawa-san. I think from demonstration project to new policy banking, Japan is clearly leading the way in APAC region. And now it's time for some really interesting questions from our live audience. So first of all, as we all know, Japan's CCUS roadmap outlines some ambitious storage capacity target. So how is METI, the Japanese government, supporting the development of infrastructure and the regulatory framework to meet these goals?
Well, it is very challenging, and we are starting with what we must do. As I explained, we started with conducting feasibility studies in Japan. This is to show the technical the viability of those projects, and we have to make sure that there is public acceptance to CCS activities. We are fortunate, as of now, we are getting a positive response from the local community hosting carbon dioxide storage, which is very important. These feasibility studies have been followed by the establishment of the legal framework to govern CCS activities within Japan. But as I said, we would need to have the policy support to narrow the gap, the cost gap between the cost of CCS and the cost of CO2. And that's the reason why, as of now, the most important step for us is to introduce a CFD, a contract for difference system, to narrow this gap between the cost for CCS and the cost of CO2. And finally, we cannot do it alone within Japan, so we are seeking collaboration with our Asian neighbors, including Australia, so that we would have international CCS activities, including shipping of CO2 to those countries, and including having cross-border credits with those countries.
Yes. So, Tadawa-san, could you please help us explain how is the Japanese government supporting the formation of CCUS hubs, and what are the leading locations or regions under consideration for the large-scale deployment?
Well, as I explained, currently the Japanese government is supporting 9 feasibility studies for CCS, 5 domestic and 4 international. I cannot pick any one of them because the 9 projects are basically in competition among each other. But I would have to say, in terms of which project is ahead of others, the Tomokomai project I mentioned, which is taking place in Hokkaido, the North Island of Japan, is going ahead of others in terms of advancement. After the Tomokomai project, which is going ahead, and also a pipeline-based project, we have 2 other domestic projects in Japan, which will be utilizing pipelines. One is near the metropolitan area of Tokyo. The other is near Niigata, which is on the Sea of Japan side of Japan. The reason why these projects may go ahead is that they do not depend upon shipping of CO2. The CO2 can be transported using pipelines. The reason why the pipeline-based project may go ahead is that the shipping yards currently are at full capacity. So building ships to carry CO2 may take more time than pipelines. So I would expect those pipeline-based projects in Japan to go ahead of other projects. But in terms of the scale of CO2 storage, we expect international projects to be much larger in the scale of CO2 storage. Among the 4 projects we are pursuing internationally, 3 are related to Malaysia. So I would expect CCUS projects with Malaysia, either one of those 3 projects with Malaysia, to be the first among the international CCUS projects, which will come with larger scale than the domestic projects in Japan.
Thank you, Tadawa-san, for all of your detailed explanations. And I think I'm very much convinced that Japan's strategy for a regional value chain building will offer vast inspirations for emerging markets and itself. Thank you so much for your invaluable participation.
Well, thank you. It has been my great pleasure to participate. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, what an extraordinary session we've had today. Over the past 2 hours, we had the privilege of hearing directly from some of the most influential voices in global carbon management, from Europe to North America and Asia Pacific. We've explored how countries are converting strategy into action through robust policy, innovative regulations, and bold project execution. Throughout today's dialogue, one theme has echoed loudly. CCUS is no longer a future technology, it's a present-day imperative. And yeah, to truly reach scale, what's needed now is precision. Precision in policy, clarity in regulations, and confidence in investments. This alignment is how we get from promise to performance, from pilot to portfolios, from scattered successes to systematic changes. So before we close, I warmly invite all of you to join us in person as a Carbon Capture Global Summit 2025 taking place in London on September 2nd and 3rd, because this will be a premier gathering of the global CCUS leaders where strategic visions meet real-world solutions. You will hear from senior representatives of the British, Norwegian, Danish, and Brazilian governments, and from industry giants like Shell, Uniper, ExxonMobil, and Unicor, and Equinor. The goal is simple but urgent: to build the partnerships and the framework that will drive CCUS into the next decisive decade. Whether you're a policymaker, project developer, investors, or academic, this is your platform, your community, and your summit. We're deeply grateful for your presence here today, and we hope you leave with fresh idea, renewed energy, and a clear vision of the path forward. Thank you once again for joining us for today's Impact webinar. We look forward to seeing you in London this September. Until then, stay inspired, stay engaged, and stay ambitious. The future of carbon capture is being written now and includes all of us. Thank you. Goodbye.